By now, almost all of us have experienced it. We may not like it, but for better or worse, it's a part of the new world in which we live and part of this new daily attempt at something that feels normal. Though a mere 7 months ago, we might not have ever been able to envision it, before the world turned upside down, before Zoom zoomed in, and we so quickly shifted our meetings, our classrooms, our family gatherings, our boardroom decisions, our worship to a purely virtual format. The truth is, now, it's almost second nature. Now we know that if we want to be heard, we first have to unmute ourselves. Now, granted, some people get around this challenge by simply never muting in the first place. We've likely all been in those meetings where we can hear the dog barking in the kitchen, the TV blaring in the background, and the toilet flushing someplace just off camera, hopefully. In other words, we've experienced that moment in which we can hear virtually everything, which, as we know, means that in the end we can hear virtually nothing. Like a presidential debate, there's a lot of noise, but at some point we just tune it out. Others of us, of course, have the opposite challenge, don't we? Where we forget to unmute ourselves when we finally build up the courage to step into that virtual window and finally lend our voice to the cause, when we start to say something very meaningful, bordering on brilliant, if we do say so ourselves, only to have everyone on the screen wave their hand and unmute themselves together just to tell us that we can't be heard. You're muted, Stephen. What a world we're living in. And yet, it's not that new, is it? Granted, the mechanics might be a little different. Few of us prior to this moment had the experience of our mouths moving but no sound coming out. But almost all of us have known what it's like to say something and have it not be heard, and not just the preachers among us. We know what it's like to try and speak into the world, to try and say something to someone, only to have it ignored, brushed aside, drowned out by those louder, more virulent voices out there. And in the world, we can't simply press a button to fix it. In other words, we know what it's like to have something to say, to try and say something, only to have it shut down, only to have it ignored, only to finally convince ourselves that maybe our voice doesn't really matter. It doesn't take it happening very long for that to happen. It's hard to overcome. We may try to speak, but if we're not heard, we start to convince ourselves that maybe we never had anything to say. Maybe some of us are there this morning. The good news is that it's not true. Your voice matters. Just in case no one's ever told you before, your voice matters. That's a part of our faith. It's part of the promise of the gospel that every voice matters. All God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low, some sing higher. In other words, friends, we can't be fully who God is calling us to be if we don't have all of the voices joined together. We miss the richness. We miss the harmony. We miss you. Only sometimes, as we've learned from Zoom, if we want to be heard, we have to first unmute ourselves. And because in life there's no simple button to make that happen, because so many of us have been told in so many different ways that our voice doesn't count, it's going to take some courage to speak up, to believe that we have something to say, and then to actually say it. What would that mean for you? It's not a bad day to consider it. After all, you may not know this, but today is Confirmation Sunday. In a moment, if the technology works as we hope it will, we will see our confirmands confirm their faith, that is, to use their voices to commit to taking that next step in faith on their own, to move forward on that faith journey on their own, to take it on for themselves. And we, though it was recorded yesterday, will affirm it today by lending our voices to theirs so that we might have an even fuller choir. All of us are together. That's the hope. Our confirmands will use their voice. Our hope is that it's not the last time they will use their voice, that today they will move forward and make that commitment to keep moving forward in the faith, to keep asking those questions. In fact, our hope really is that they will step away from this process with more questions than answers, and that they might beware of those who claim to have all of the answers, because the truth is none of us do. The commitment we make to them is to always be a listening board, to always be listening to the questions that they're asking and trying to figure it out together. That's the challenge of faith. As a people of faith, our job is to keep looking at the world and seeing not just what is, but what could be. As George Bernard Shaw famously wrote, "You see things as they are and ask why, but I dream things that never were and ask, why not?" In some ways, friends, that is what we are called to do as people of faith, to not just see the world that could be, but to speak it into being. Look at Jesus. He didn't settle for the status quo. Part of what got him in trouble was that he didn't settle for the status quo. He was willing to lend his voice, not just to see that things were wrong, but to speak into it and to, with his own life, demonstrate what that different world could look like. That's the thing. Sometimes we have to make sure that our actions match our mouths, because the truth is, actions speak louder than words, but the words still matter. In our story for today, we have from the Gospel of Matthew, written 50 years later, speaking mainly to a Jewish audience. We have Matthew trying to help the Jewish audience understand who Jesus was and the ways that he challenged the status quo, represented in this case by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those religious leaders who just couldn't get it through their heads what this was all about. That's sometimes what happens when we use our voices. We get shot down. In this case, in our story, the Pharisees tried to put Jesus in his place like insecure teachers. When a student asks a question, they try to make the student look dumb. Maybe some of us have been there. The Pharisees wait until Jesus is in a crowd of people. That's how shaming works. And they try to get him to ask a question. Now, frankly, it's a good question they ask. Which of the commandments is the greatest? Which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, it's a question we have asked from time to time. Frankly, it's a question that we've put to our confirmands over and over again. If we were to evacuate everything else from this faith, if we were to let go of all the doctrine and dogma, all of the detritus of faith that has built up over the last 2,000 years, what would be left? What is at the core? What is the one thing you can't get rid of? We know it. Now, we hear the question, of course, and we immediately jump to the answer. We like the answer that answer of love, but we forget the threat that was raised behind the question. See, the Pharisees were really trying to trip Jesus up. They were trying to get him to take all of those laws and to say that some are more important than the others. But Jesus, fortunately for us, fortunately for him, had a response. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, we hear it as sort of a mic drop moment. When Jesus finally lets it out, he lets it go, and they have to struggle with what it means. But if we read the passage, especially in Matthew's gospel, we recognize that it doesn't stop there. See, the Pharisees have asked Jesus a question. He's told them his response, and now it's their turn to listen. That's part of how conversation works. If we're willing to speak, we also have to be patient enough to listen to the truth that is shared with us. Remember, Matthew's writing to this Jewish audience who had this vision in mind of what's going to happen when the Messiah returns. They had David in mind, a return to the kingdom of David, that is a united kingdom in which all of Israel is able to come together, and more importantly, that all who are not Israel will be pushed out. They had this idea that all the enemies of Israel would be put to the sword when the Messiah returns. But Jesus has just told them, as Paula so beautifully put it, that their neighbor is not just the people who are right next door. It's everyone. He asked them, you've been talking about David, but you're not thinking big enough. See, up until this moment, Matthew has done his very best to try and compare Jesus to David, trying to set them side by side until this very moment in which he turns that on its head and says, the truth is, he's even greater than David, that you're not thinking big enough. You're thinking about the throne of Israel, but we're thinking about the king of the entire world. That is, the one who will come and unite us all, in which nobody is excluded, in which all are brought together. And when the Pharisees hear it, as so often happens to bullies when they're stood up to, they don't know what to do. And so they throw up their hands, and the passage ends with the promise that they will never again ask another question. And in so doing, they miss out. We can't be afraid of truth when we find it, friends, because it is the truth that will set us free. We can't be afraid of truth as we have been. Think of all the ways we've talked about the challenges of science, as if science and faith are somehow competing with one another. They're not. Where there is truth, there is God. We need not fear it because God is already there. Friends, if we're going to speak in love, we have to listen in truth and trust that that truth will set us free, that that truth can change us. That is also something we celebrate today, the ability for people of faith to change. After all, in addition to being Confirmation Sunday, today is also Reformation Sunday. It's the day in which we remember Martin Luther on October 31st, 1517, nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, and in so doing sparking the Protestant Reformation. We Protestants know something about protest. He changed the world. Friends, there is so much around our world right now in need of changing. How might we lend our voice to the cause? What is it that we care most about in this world, and can we speak to it? Can we speak into it with the people we love, one relationship at a time, finding a way to reach out, to speak up, to stand up, to go instead of stay? How can we in this moment use our voice effectively for change, speaking in love but listening in truth, paying attention to those voices that don't usually get heard? We see protests every day downtown and around our world right now. They're there because people have not been heard. Let us listen to what they're saying and lend our voice to the cause of justice. We see it in the political rallies, regardless of what side of the aisle you find yourself on. They are there because people feel like something needs to change. And you know what? They're right. Something does need to change. Only the way that we do it is not through exclusion, it's through inclusion. It's not by pushing people out, it's by embracing them in love. It's by speaking in love and listening in truth. Friends, what will you use your voice for? Our prayer for the confirmations is that for our confirmands is that they will never stop speaking, that they will not mute themselves, but find words for the ways that they are feeling, and know that there are people here willing to listen, to hear, and to find a way forward together. Our prayer for them is that they will continue to listen for those voices that have historically been left out, that we might find our way together. Friends, speak in love. Listen in truth, and by God's grace and with great humility, don't be afraid to unmute yourselves. All God's critters got a place in the choir, and we will miss your voice if you don't share it. Sometimes in life, in order to be heard, we first have to unmute ourselves. Amen.